Hi, I'm Marina from Frocks Frolics, and today I'm going to show you how to sew the bishop sleeve. We already have made the pattern for this, and if you haven't tuned into that one, you can do that, of course. The link is in the description. It's also under the info box in the top here, so if you click on the I for info, then you'll also find the link to that video, and there's also a link at the end of this video to that video, so you cannot miss it. As you can see here, I've got all my stuff already cut out. So I have the sleeve, I've got 2 times the cuff, which we need, and then I've got some bias binding from the shop, or alternatively you can do your own bias binding, and I'm going to show you now how to put all this together. The first thing you need to do is to iron some interfacing on the underside of one of your cuffs so that it's nice and stable. And I've also rounded the edges a bit because I thought that would be nicer than the cuff that I've used from the Virginia sleeve, which didn't have that. You can make your own bias binding or you can buy it. I'm going to just quickly show you how you make your own bias binding. The first thing you want to do for your bias binding is to iron it over so you have a crease directly on the middle. Then the next thing is to turn one of the sides in. Do not go all the way to the middle. You want to be shy of the middle, otherwise it'll make it unnecessarily thick. Now I'm going to do the other side as well. And this time I'm going a little bit closer to the edge, right? But not quite in it either, but fairly close. And now what you want to do is reinforce the crease you already had. Now you want to turn over your bias binding so that the shorter side, which we left about 3 millimeters shorter, faces you. And then when you fold this over, you will see that it is about 1.5 millimeters, just very little, but it is shorter than the other one. And so that means that when we sew it on, it's going to make our life a lot easier. When you look at this in a close-up, you can see that one side is shorter. That way, if we top stitching it, we make sure that it absolutely catches. The next thing we're going to do is put this bias binding on, and I'm going to cut the ends off. I think that's really advisable. So always make it like extra long, and then you cut the ends off because you want it to be like the best, and the beginning and the end never is. So you just cut it off. When I want to put on my bias binding, I need to make sure that the shorter side here always sits at the top, so that when I stitch it down here, the underside definitely will catch. So what you want to do is take the upper side of the fabric, and then we're going to put the bias binding in here. And you don't need to slide it in all the way, yeah, just slide it in maybe sort of 0.5 centimeter to that point. And then we're going to put a pin into that area here to secure it. Now the bias binding is going to go from one end to the other, and where you've got the tip of it here, you're only just going to catch it. It's going to sit in there and you're just going to catch it. What you don't do is move it in like that, because you're going to end up with a pleat. So we don't want to do that. We want it to just sit on there, right? Now, if you are a beginner and you've never done this before, you can put a little pin in here. I don't use a pin for that, but you can. And equally with the other side, you can also put a little pin in here just to make sure, so that when we then sew it in, and we do this in one go, we're not going to sew it on here one side and then turn it over. We're just going to do it straight away, and it is really is possible. In fact, I think actually it makes it easier. If you sew it on first, it just adds an extra step and makes it harder. Now we can go to the sewing machine and we can just sew it in. And because I want you to see this really well, I haven't changed the thread. I'm still using a really dark thread here, so you can see it very well, because this sleeve is never going to see the light of day. So that's a good way to do it for you guys, just for this instructional video. And I'm starting here, not at the end. That's why I leave it standing a little bit over, so that I can start directly on this point here, close to the edge. And I know that I'm going to catch it on the underside, because the underside is a little bit longer. And then you want to take out the pin that's still in there and make sure it's nice and flat. Now you want to move your bias binding so that it feeds in straight, and you can see what you're doing here. Right, and we're going to just sew up to this point here. I'm going to make very sure that I hold on in the center part so that it can't slip out. And then while I'm holding it, I'm going all the way down. And I'm not forgetting to remove the pin at the lower end. Secure your stitches. And that's it basically. We've got the slit in. I always find it very difficult to do when I'm on camera, because I've got this funny angle, so mine is never like all that perfect. And I'm just going to show you my old lady glasses I have to put on for that. And then I can see properly, and they were $1.50, but they really do help me. I can't see it all that well, so please forgive me if this is not perfect when we have a closer look. And when I look at this now, it's fairly even. You know, I didn't do the best job in the world on this, but better than nothing. And it, of course, catches on the underside. That's what we wanted to see. Now, what we want for a slit is that it shuts like this when it's done. Okay, so this is the upper side of the fabric, and we want to shut it like this. And that will give me that really nice little cuff opening. It's really simple. Okay. And I'm going to have that in place if I sew across there, so that it can't go anywhere and it'll just sit there safe. Don't forget to lock in your stitches, and also make your stitch length 1.5, because it's only a tiny little area we're stitching, and we really don't want this to be a long stitch. Now I can give this a quick press just so it stays in place a bit, and I don't forget which side has to be folded over, because believe you me, when you're making shirts like ladies shirts, and I've made loads, that easily happens. You'll very likely end up with that tiny little pleat here at the top. That is not a problem. You will find that on most of your lady blouses you've got. You can now either serge on both sides and then put the seam together for the sleeve, or you can put it together, sew together, and then serge it in one go. It really depends on the thickness of your fabric. In this case, I'm going to serge them both sides and iron them apart, because I'm using linen. And if this was for a real garment that I'm actually making, linen always tends to thicken up if it's in a seam, even if it's very, very light linen. So I prefer to iron these apart. I've now overlocked it here, as you can see, or serged, and I can put both sides together and just sew them together with a seam allowance. 1 centimeter is usually what I do for all my patterns. Don't forget to lock in your stitches at the beginning and the end of everything you sew. Make sure the edges line up, and then you're good to go. And that's it. Cut off your thread. Now we can get on and iron this seam apart. You can of course use a sleeve ironing board for this. I just want you to see it properly, and that always comes up too high and my arm is somewhere up there. Next, we're going to go back to the sewing machine and I'm going to put a gather thread all the way around the edge. And now we want to make the stitch length a lot longer, and I've just noticed I was still on 1.5, so I sewn this with 1.5. Now that was really not necessary. I had wondered why it took so long. So you want to get back up with your stitch length to the biggest stitch available on your sewing machine, and on mine that's 4.5. And then we're going to go just about a half a foot from the edge here, so line that up with that line, go all the way around, and then we're going to go all the way around again, right foot width next to that, so that we have 2 gather stitches. And now we're doing another one, foot width next to it. Now I've sewn this together, I just want to show you one little thing. When you look at your bishop sleeve, what you will notice with a pattern is that in the front area here, which will round, we don't have as much gather, yeah? And we have twice as much gather in the other areas. So what you want to do is you put your sleeve down. That's my front bit. And then I've already marked it here. But if you put on your sleeve with a 1 centimeter overlap, and you can see roughly where that ends around this area, you know that from here to there you will need less gather. So when I gather this, I make sure that I don't have so much on here, and I'm also not going to put as much in underneath the arm, where it's literally underneath. You don't want a ton there, so I'm going to do slightly less there as well. That's just something to remember. And if you wanted to just know a very quick way of doing this is if you just fold it flat like this and you go, yep, from the slit to there I'm going to do slightly less, and I'm going to have the massive amount here on that side. And now we're going to put the cuff on, and what's a little bit different here is that I'm going to put the single cuff on first, the one with the interfacing on, right? And I'm going to pin that to my top here, and that's why it was so good that we've already ironed this, because I can't go wrong now. So I just turn this over, and I'm just gonna put a pin in here to hold it in place. And then another pin on the other side, and again I'm just letting it stand over the seam allowance, which is 1 centimeter. Now I'm going to put a pin here as well, because we don't want one side to be pulled out when we pull from the other side. Wrap it around in a figure of 8 so that it can't go anywhere. Now we're pulling from the other side until it fits. Now I can do the same on the other side. I wrap my thread round in a figure of 8. I'm just going to pin it in now so I can see whether or not my sleeve sits really well. Now I'm going to just shut one side to check that nothing has pulled. Now when you look at this, you can see there's a little bit less gather on this edge. I mean, if you find this really, you go, oh, I don't know where to do it, just do it evenly. It won't make such a big difference on a little child's item. If you're making this for an adult, I think I would be a little bit more careful with it, but for a child it doesn't matter so much because the distance really isn't that great. This looks good now. I've decided that I can leave my sleeve like that And then what I'm going to do now is I'm going to sew it in. Don't forget to take your stitch length back down. And that was it here. Can take out my pins, and I have attached the cuff to the sleeve. Now you have to decide how you're going to close your sleeve, and you could put ruler loops on if you wanted to do that, and some really cute buttons to close this. This would be lovely actually. Then you can just watch my video where I show how to make a ruler loop and attach it. I've done it many times, so I'm not doing it here, but that is definitely something you can do. And if you were to do that, then the ruler loops need to go on now. But I'm going to put on KamSnaps, and because I'm doing that, I can leave it as is. Next, I'm going to pick up the other part of my sleeve and I'm going to sew it on. Now, there are two ways that you can do a cuff. One is the one that I would recommend for everyone that's starting to sew because it's really easy. And then for the ones that say as little hand stitching as possible, we have a different method. So the first one, an easier one, is to fold over here your seam allowance and then just simply pin this in. And we're going to sew all the way around to the other side. And again, you have that folded down, go edge to edge here, come up here with the right seam allowance of 1 centimeter standing over, right? Depends where it gets to really, you know, so any mistake you've made previously, you're just like, it won't show in the end. So that's the one method, and that's what I'm going to do with you in a minute. There's another method which is done when you go to industrial manufacture, and that is that you simply fold in this part here, fold it in so that it lies nice and flat. Put your edges on top of each other like that. Most industrial seamstresses won't even pin this. Stick in this part of the cuff as far as you can. Have it nice and flat and start sewing from about here. So that would mean that this edge will be completely enclosed and you end up here with only like a little bit here that you have to then sew together. So you would go all the way around to the other side as you did before. But here we're also going to fold down your cuff and then stick this on top. And on the other side, I don't just do 2 or 3 centimeters. I keep sticking in my cuff as far as I can go and sew it together. And that eliminates that I have to do all the turning in and then, you know, pinning it. In theory, and of course for those that can sew really well, that's a great method because that way you have maybe that much that you just need to slip stitch or top stitch. And if you're top stitching, you won't have to do any hand stitching or pinning. And it's really great. But I think most people will get this wrong. And so what I'm doing is basically going edge to edge, and all I need to do is make sure that this edge down here is a perfect. Now I'm just going to make sure that my edges line up. I'm going to fold it down because that's a simpler one. I want to show you what you can really do. Anyone that is a beginner can do this as well. It's not difficult. We're going to start here and sew all the way around. We're pinning only these 2 bits first. The rest we're doing on the sewing machine. No need to pin this before you even go on. And I place my needle down exactly next to where the bias binding starts. And then I'm sewing around with 1 centimeter seam allowance. Now, if this edge here wasn't 1 centimeter but foot width, then you go around foot width. If it's 1 centimeter, you do 1 centimeter. You want it to be nice and straight. If you're sewing a curve, you should reduce the stitch length a little bit so that you don't get little corners into your curves and it's nice and smooth. When you're sewing the curve, you want to go stitch by stitch if need be. Just keep lifting up the presser foot, moving it a stitch forward, then put the presser foot back down and go another stitch forward. And that way you get a really lovely round curve. You could also mark this, of course, with a textile marker before you start. Now I'm going to sew to the other end, and I'm just grabbing the end of my cuff here, and I can extend my stitch length again to 2.5 until I get to the next curve. At this point, I want to put the stitch length back down and then move around the curve exactly the same way as I just did coming down. Now I'm going back up in the same way. At this point, you can extend the stitch length again. Move the top edge to edge and see to it that you end exactly where the bias binding ends. And here you can see my seam allowance isn't perfect. So I'm ending at this point here. I'm just going to guide it in. Now we're going to cut pretty smartish along the edge of my stitching, whereas we can leave the seam allowance everywhere else standing. Next, we're going to turn our cuff and give it a good press. We're going to go right in with our thumbs here and hold it with our pointer fingers so that we can easily turn the curve. Move out the rounds here. Yeah, it's only a tiny little round, but it looks really nice. You can go as exaggerated as you want to or leave it all straight. That's also possible. We'll roll it out with our fingers, making sure everything sits nice. We'll roll it until we have got the seam right in the crease. And now we're going to pin it, as you do. So we fold under our seam allowance and we just pin it against the seam nice and flat. And then we can do it either with a slip stitch or we could machine stitch once around. Now you need to decide whether you want to use a sewing machine or hand stitch it, and I'm going to use the sewing machine real quick because it is a sample. If I was making something, you know, for a really special event, I probably wouldn't. I would prefer to do it by hand, and if you want to do it by hand, I've got plenty of videos there in my Sewing 101 course, which you can get at the Academy. Where I show you all the different hand stitches really slowly, and you can just have a look at that. So that's Sewing 101, and the link to that course, which is by the way free, so you don't have to pay anything, you can find on my academy at frocksandfrolics.com. Now we're going to sew from in here along the edge, and that always means that when you're sewing a cuff like that, you want it to be turned inside out and sew from the inside of your cuff. One of the tips is that you never start where it's really visible. So where you don't want to start is here on the edge. You want to start somewhere in the middle. You also want to change the stitch length now, and you want to go up to 3 or 3.5, so it's not little dinky stitches next to each other. For right-handed people, it's easier if the sleeve faces into the machine and the cuff faces to the outside. You want to find a fixed point on your presser foot that you can line the edge of the fabric up with. At this point you can pull from the back so that the stitching doesn't hammer in the same place but actually moves at the right distance. When we go around the curve, again you need to be really careful and you need to do it stitch by stitch. And on this side we do the same stitch by stitch around the curve. The next step is now to remove your gather threads and then give it a nice press again. I'm ironing the outside of the cuff with a still turned sleeve. Now I'm going to turn my sleeve to the right hand side. What you could do now is put buttonholes in here, 3 buttonholes I would suggest, or you put in KamSnaps. And here are my KamSnap tools that I need for it. I've got the pliers from Dritz and they really are not working that well anymore. This part here didn't last so long, but then again I use it a lot. Then I have my owl to pierce through, and I've got all these lovely colors here to choose from. A lot of the colors that you buy from KamSnaps I tend to not use, most of them. You know, because they are pretty wild at times. So I'm going to find a color now that looks quite nice. I've got a more creamy white. I think I go for that. What you will find with those is that very often the colors are way too bright for what you need, but you can also get nice shapes like hearts and stuff. So I think they're really perfect, and I would definitely make sure that I have a set of those if you're sewing a lot. Makes your life easier, is much quicker than putting in buttons. And here we got your KamSnaps. You've got 6 of the actual buttons, and then you need the 3 studs and then the counterpart to that here. So one has a rounded rim and one has a sharp rim, right? So you need one of each. That's all there is to it. You want to overlap the same amount all the way down. And then you want to mark where they're going to go. Now don't go too high up, because I should have really cut back the seam allowance. Just take it from me, cut back the seam allowance and here a little bit more, because actually I didn't think about that. The KamSnaps will not stay in. Since this is not going anywhere, it's just a sample sleeve, it's okay for me. But if you made this and your KamSnap doesn't go in or it comes off, it's really no good. So make sure that you cut back the seam allowance in here a little bit more. Just take your button, right, and you put it where you want it to be, like this. You press down a bit. You can actually see where that is, and then you can mark it, okay? And the same with the top one. So that's how I would do it if you're doing it for the first time. And then we're just going to measure the distance, which is 6.5 or 6.6. Now, one thing that I do when I'm not sure where the middle is, I make sure that I got the same overlap on both sides. So here you can see my tape measure goes a little bit over, and on the other side as well. So I know that at 3.5, that's going to be the perfect distance. That's just me. Now what you want to do is go with your owl all the way through both layers. Take it out of the top layer. Push the KamSnap through from underneath. Take the one with a rounded edge and press in. It's really simple. And then that can't go anywhere. Now take out your owl, push through the top of the button. The sharp edge KamSnap part needs to be placed over the top. Put it into your pliers and press down hard. Now I can close the KamSnap and do the next one. Put the owl in place and press through both layers. Open up the lower KamSnap. Move out the owl from the lower layer. Push through the spike. Add the part with a rounded edge. And then press down. Now we're going to pull out the owl out of the top layer. Add another button. And now we take the part with a sharp edge. And now we can press it together with the pliers. And now we just do exactly the same with a third KamSnap, and then we're finished. And that's it. Our beautiful cuff has been attached to our bishop sleeve. Thank you again for watching and being part of this little mini project. And if you wanted me to show something in particular, then you can put that into the comments. Next week, I'm going to be back with something else, and I don't know what it's going to be yet. So do comment and tell me what you would like to see. Bye for now.